We're continuing our monthly collaboration with my friends at Learn Liberty this week. My guest is Head of Education at the Institute for Economic Affairs in London, as well as a historian and lecturer, and he flew all the way across the pond to be here. Dr. Steve Davies, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
I heard you got held up by President Obama.
So we did. We just got told that a VIP was going through the airport, and so they had to shut it down for half an hour, so we were held up. I guess it must have been really important.
Yeah, after an 11-and-a-half-hour flight, you don't even want to hear that it's the president, or there's nobody really that makes that acceptable.
Yes.
Yeah, so, all right, there's so much that I want to do with you, and I watched a ton of your Learn Liberty videos, so I'm pretty well-versed in some of the stuff that you're well-versed in. First, did you want to come to America just one more time before our election?
Well, absolutely. There's something really strange going on here in the United States, I think it's fair to say. Although maybe not that strange, because I actually think that what's happening with Donald Trump is part of a more widespread phenomenon in most Western democracies, which is the rise of a kind of politics that's commonly described, I think, misleadingly, as right-wing populism. And what it actually is a politics that combines left-of-centre economics, strong support for the welfare state, with an extremely unpleasant kind of nativism, anti-globalism, nationalism. And that's pretty much where Donald Trump is coming from. It's straightforward Hamiltonian economic nationalism combined with a very unpleasant kind of identity politics, I would say.
Yeah.
But he's not alone. He's part of a much bigger phenomenon.
Okay, so let's unpack a couple of those phrases there. So you'd say this isn't a right-wing phenomenon because his politics are kind of left, right? And but he is using nationalism, so
Yes.
that is more of the right side.
Yeah.
What were the other parts that were?
Well, there's also support for the welfare state,
Support
but
for
on a
the
strictly national basis. I mean, the correct name for this kind of politics, I think, is nationalist collectivism. You could call it national socialism, but that kind of been claimed already.
That might be a little too scary.
Be too scary, yeah. It's nationalist collectivism, basically. And it's on the rise across most Western democracies. A few exceptions like Spain, Portugal, Ireland, but otherwise this is the kind of politics that we see on the rise everywhere, I'm afraid. Marine Le Pen in France, Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, Donald Trump here, pretty much everywhere. Canada's another exception.
So what is happening globally that has caused that this isn't just I mean, I think everyone in America thinks everything's about us all the time and this is just our phenomenon and it's nothing to do with anything else. But what's happening globally?
Well, there are two things, I think. One of them is that a lot of the support for this kind of politics comes from older, working class voters in what you would call the Rust Belt, decayed, ex-industrial areas where life has not been good for quite a long time. And these people feel that they're ignored by the political establishment, that the system is not working in their interests, and they're kicking back.
Yeah.
That's one reason.
And some of that you would argue is legit, right?
Yeah, it's legitimate. Yeah, indeed. They're quite right. You know, life has been pretty hard for them for quite a long time.
Yeah.
The other thing, though, which I actually think is more important, is it's to do with the politics of identity. It's to do with a feeling that a certain kind of identity is under threat from the process of globalization, cosmopolitanism, maybe political correctness, a whole bunch of stuff like that. So there's a very powerful cultural reaction, a reassertion of a certain kind of identity. And I think that is what is really potent and really driving this kind of politics.
So how much of that is just a reaction to some of the stuff happening on the left? That's, you know, I come from the left, so that's the part that I've been focusing on, and I do see a certain element of the rise of Trump and the political correctness stuff and, you know, the social justice warrior stuff. I see it as a natural reaction to what has happened on the left. Do you see or maybe in Europe it's more because of immigration that you know, these people, Marie Le Pen, for example, et cetera.
I think there is an element of truth in both of those things, actually. Undoubtedly, the push-button issue, as we saw in the Brexit referendum in the UK, for example, and with Marine Le Pen, is immigration, particularly immigration from the Middle East, but also from other parts of the world as well. But that, in a way, is not so much because of immigration per se, it's because of the way in which large-scale movement of people is seen to be transforming and changing the nature of a settled and established national community. And now, I think that in terms, particularly of the United States, yes, there is quite a lot of pushback against the kind of social justice warrior, as you alluded to, PC politics on the left. And in particular, the politics of identity. If you're going to push a politics of identity where apparently the only group who aren't allowed to have an identity are white working class men, sooner or later, those kind of people are going to say, well, hold on a minute, you know, I have this identity too, which you are not respecting to your own terms. So there's a lot of pushback coming on. And I think that shows how really the response that liberals need to have, and I would include many people on the left in that category, should be one where you assert the importance of individualism, and of identity as being something that to a great degree is personally chosen and formed rather than being something that's given to you and fixed in some way.
Yeah, I mean, I love that, and that's exactly how my own evolution has sort of happened over the last couple of years, coming out of progressivism, which is more about the collective, to ultimately realize I would only want to be judged by my own thoughts and my own actions. So let's circle back a little bit to Europe, and then we'll do our election, then we'll get into some big stuff. So when it comes to the immigration situation all over Europe, I sense what you're saying is there's a certain natural reaction to people coming in and not assimilating properly, or whatever else there may be, the economic strains and all that stuff. What is the proper solution for all these countries now? Because the cat's out of the bag already.
Right. Well, actually, a lot of the response is misguided, in my view. Because, for example, there is a widespread perception and feeling that immigration imposes costs on the countries that the immigrants go to. All of the research shows that actually this is not the case. Immigrants are actually extremely good news, because typically they are younger than the host population. They are almost always in work. They've come to look for work. They want to do productive labor. How can that be a problem, you might say? And so typically they are taxpayers rather than tax consumers. They typically make a net contribution to the budget. They do not depress wages, because typically they do work that the indigenous population either can't or won't do, usually because they lack the skill set. They do have a marginal depressing effect on the wages of the bottom 10% of the income range, but that's about it. But there's a widespread misconception or misunderstanding of what the economics of immigration is actually about, and that's a failure of public education, really. So that's part of it. I think the more profound thing, though, is a feeling that there's a threat to an established indigenous culture. And I think the response here is to simply be more confident. You know, I have enormous confidence in the assimilative power of the culture of a free society. And I think the thing to do is not to say, okay, here are people who are asserting a particular collective cultural identity. What we need to do is assert our own one in response to that and aggressively against that first one. The thing to do is to emphasize individualism and the degree to which a modern free society is one where people are free to form and shape their own identity through the choices that they make, and that should be true for everybody.
Right, so in a way you're looking at it in sort of the macro sense of how we should deal with all this. A certain amount of the people on the ground, they just don't see it that way, because they see, well, here are these people coming in. Even if the job thing isn't correct, they feel that their jobs are being taken. So when I read stories about things like in Germany, that I saw something that it was going to cost 1.4 billion euros to give the refugees or the migrants dental care. I mean, these things are just not true, basically.
That's not true. That isn't true. If you look at the areas where there are problems, these are all areas where it's the state that is involved or is a major provider. You do not see grocery stores panicking because they suddenly have to find food products and other products for new customers. On the contrary, they look at it as a business opportunity. The private sector everywhere actually sees large-scale movement of people as being, as I say, an opportunity, not a problem. It's the areas where the state is involved that you find problems. And what that shows us is actually the incompetence and inefficiency of modern governments as compared to the private sector.
So even if we viewed everyone as the individual, and we're going to talk a lot about the individual here, do you think there's possibly something different with this wave of immigration, especially related to terrorism? And we know that there's a certain amount of people that ISIS wants to infiltrate and cross borders, that there is something different about this. Because even if all of us in the West say it's about individualism and let's judge people individually and by their actions and all of those things, if a certain amount of people don't want to assimilate, what do you do then?
Well, in one sense, not assimilating is not in and of itself a problem. Where I live in Manchester, there's a well-established Jewish community, been there since the 1880s, 1890s. These people are Hasidic Jews, very strict, ultra-Orthodox. A lot of them are Lubavitchers, actually, and they're not assimilated in some senses at all. They've never watched television, for example, against their beliefs and so on. But nobody, I think, would regard that as a problem. From my point of view, it just means I've got a wonderful bakery near me where I can get fantastic bagels. The problem is, as you say, the association of a certain category of migrants from the Middle East with Islamic terrorism. Now, what's the best way to respond to that? That is a difficult issue. My own view very much is that the ultimate solution is to try and sort out the complete mess that the Middle East has become. But in the short term, essentially this is a policing problem. What you definitely don't want to think about is dealing with this as a problem of military security. It's essentially a law enforcement problem.
Right. So as someone that doesn't love state power, does it make you nervous that you have to sort of give a certain amount of state power to the police or to the border controls
Yeah.
or whatever to actually make sure that they're doing the right job.
Yes, I am nervous about that. And what I would say, by the way, is that the kind of increase in state surveillance, which has been put through in the United Kingdom, for example, by our current Prime Minister when she was in her previous job as Home Secretary, is actually counterproductive in that regard. Because basically, if you think about the task the security services have got, they're looking for the proverbial needle in a haystack. So if that's the case, why do you then make the haystack even bigger by intercepting virtually everybody's email? That actually makes their job more difficult, not easier.
Yeah.
And so I think that actually what really you need is good old-fashioned undercover intelligence work, which means penetrating organizations, identifying key people you basically track and keep an eye on, and good old-fashioned spy work, really. It's not always going to work, but that's the way to do it.
So it's interesting because you're making a real argument for limited government and slim, trim government through a prism that a lot of people don't think of it. They think we need big government to protect us from things and have surveillance and all of these things, the people that are for it. But you're really making an argument for if you actually took a lot of that away, it might be a more efficient way of dealing with it.
It would be much more effective in my view.
Huh, that's really interesting. So let's talk about Brexit a little bit, because I did a little bit of it on this show, and you know, I'm constantly talking about how our American media doesn't give us much of anything. So we didn't hear about it at all. Then 2 days before, everybody was freaking out about it. We saw it on Twitter. Then it happened, and we don't talk about it again. So for people that have no idea what happened, can you just give me a little history of it and then where we're at now?
Okay. Britain's relationship with the European Union has always been, I think, a bit fraught and difficult. It's been like one of those unhappy marriages, if you will, where outsiders wonder, why are those two people together? The reason being that British politicians and the British public, ever since we first joined the European Economic Communities, it then was, in 1973, have always seen it as being basically about economics. It's all about getting economic advantage. On the continent, however, they've been equally clear, right since the Messina Conference in 1954, that this is all about building a political union. So they see it as part of a kind of grand political project. And the British politicians always say, oh, they don't really mean it, these continentals, this is just rhetoric, which of course is actually quite offensive. You know, and not surprisingly, the continentals get a bit irritated by this attitude. So essentially there's a growing mismatch between what the British public think the EU should be and the actual nature of that project. And that's got significantly worse since the Maastricht Treaty. So it caused all kinds of internal political ructions. And David Cameron, in what I have to say was a grotesque act of misjudgment from his own perspective, called a referendum to try and sort out his internal politics. Now, in that referendum, everyone thought, the expectation was that the status quo would win. I must say, I expected that.
So that's basically why he called it, because he was in power. He figured, I'll call it, they'll agree with me.
And that'll sort out my party problem.
That's that.
Yeah,
wow,
he thought, because generally speaking, referenda normally go for the status quo.
Right.
And in this case, the overwhelming majority of members of Parliament, most of the respected pundits, most economists, virtually all of the big business firms that were asked, the Bank of England, pretty much any authority figure you care to mention said, yes, you need to vote Remain. So what took place was a popular insurgency, and in which the ordinary British public thought, well, no, we don't agree with this. And they basically went against the advice of the bulk of the political media business leadership. Now, the vote that came together to vote leave, if you will, was basically a coalition of three quite distinct groups, I think. On the one hand, you had what you might call Brexitshire, older conservative voters, typically middle class, slightly older, living in the countryside, living in the affluent suburbs. And that was one block.
So that's a little bit of the people that you described voting for Trump. It's a little bit of the older working class.
But slightly more moderate. The second group, however, are like the people who voted for Trump. This is older, white, working class voters in the traditional Labour heartlands of the northeast of England, the Midlands, Yorkshire. The vote in some constituencies there, like Sunderland, which is our equivalent of, say, Scranton Wilkes-Barre, that was 69% vote for leave. An absolute landslide. And it was that block of what you might call populist voters, working class voters, that put leave over. The third very small group, which I belong to, is what you might call radical classical liberals, who, very small group, but again, you could say we made the difference in some ways, because what we wanted was to be able to have a greater range of options for the British government by being outside the EU's controls and constraints. So it's those three blocks of people that voted for leave, basically.
Yeah, I like radical classical liberals, because I've been saying classical liberals, it sounds too too benign or something.
Yeah, yeah.
Radical has a little something extra there. So, okay, so when it was happening, and you say you were part of this, did you expect the vote to go that way?
No,
because as you're saying, the entire establishment was saying, don't do it, it's not going to happen. The polls were showing it wasn't going to happen.
No, I always thought it was going to be tight, but my own expectation was that it was going to be about 51% Remain to 49% Leave, because normally in referenda like this, the undecided voters who make up their mind at the last minute split 2-1 for the status quo. Now, I actually think they did here, but what happened was that the polls underestimated the Leave share of the vote by about 5%. The reason being, a lot of the people who voted Leave were people who did not normally vote. And pollsters always discount people who say that they don't vote. So they got their sampling wrong. And so they underestimated the share of the vote that Leave was going to get.
So looping this back to Trump, because I see such parallels here, I suspect the exact same thing is going to happen. I'm not saying Trump's going to win, but I do suspect there's a depression in the polls because a certain amount of his supporters either aren't being polled for whatever, they're in places that they're not polling, or they don't want to be publicly shamed or admitted or something like that. So I sense that what you're talking about here, this groundswell of support that was not spoken of, I suspect that's happening right now. Do you think that's fair?
I do think so. I think there's two things going on there. One is, since we're here in Los Angeles, it's known as the Tom Bradley effect, where people are not honest in the answers they give to the pollsters. But also I think that actually the pollsters' samples are probably slightly wrong. They're probably not counting the correct number of Trump voters, because one of the things he did during the primaries was to bring a record number of people into the primary process who had never voted before. Now, what I suspect that means is he's going to be much more competitive than he currently appears to be in states like Ohio, Pennsylvania, maybe even Michigan and Arizona, where I think there's a significant number of people who have not voted before who will vote.
Yeah. What do you make of when you see Nigel Farage come here and speak at Trump rallies? What do you make of the connection between the two of them? And is this really, you know, when I click on an InfoWars link or some of the other things, the more right things, Breitbart, that really they're fighting the globalists. The globalists are coming here. I think there's some degree to a one world government thing that's trying to formulate, but like how much it feels so conspiratorial. Like what's going on?
Well, that's exactly the kind of alignment that I was talking about. These both Nigel Farage and UKIP in the UK, Donald Trump here, they're part of a nationalist reaction against the increased cosmopolitanism and globalization that we've seen in the last 20 to 30 years. There's a feeling that there's transnational organizations that are pushing an agenda they don't like, but basically it's more a kind of localism, a hostility to cosmopolitanism and to globalism. And you see that on both sides of the Atlantic. Now that's a politics I strongly reject, but you can't deny the reality and the existence of it.
Yeah, and that's what makes it so hard to talk about, because it's not fun to talk about something you reject, but to be honest, to be a classical liberal, you have to acknowledge that something's happening. Which is,
absolutely.
Which is a strange
and
place.
It's no point in ignoring this. I mean, if you disagree with something, with a belief that a lot of people have, the thing to do is to engage with it. What you have to do is to actually talk to these people, respect their views, but show them that you think they are mistaken, and here's why they're mistaken.
Yeah. Okay, so now Brexit happens.
Yeah.
Everyone said the next day, the markets are going to crash, the economy is going to crash, everything will be over, we're going to be fighting for bread. Have you had bread lately?
No. Yeah. No problem with that. Exactly, I know.
No problem.
I think we're still in the phony war stage right now. I think there's going to be an enormous and quite serious political row in the United Kingdom in the next few months. The big question now is, okay, what do we do? And there are really two routes that the British government can take. Quite simply, to simplify it, one is they can go for a membership of what's called the European Economic Area, which means that we would be a bit like Norway. Now that means we would have access to the European single market regime, but we would still be bound by a lot of EU regulations, while no longer having any say in what they were or how they were formed.
So that's sort of like staying in the EU but light or
something. Exactly.
Yeah.
And the other alternative is to say, well, we don't want to do that. We basically want to negotiate a free trade deal with the EU. The trouble is that once Theresa May triggers what's called Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty, which is the withdrawal process, it's got a strict 2-year limit, and it's not clear that you can negotiate a free trade deal in just 2 years. So that would throw us back upon just membership of the World Trade Organization, which means that it would then be a 6.5% tariff between Britain and Europe. Now, that's probably more than compensated for by the decline in the value of the pound that's taken place, but it's still not very welcome. Now, the critical political thing is the City of London 7% of British GDP, would lose its passporting rights. It would not be able to do euro-denominated business unless we're in the European Economic Area. The problem politically for Theresa May and the government is that the Europeans have been very reasonably, in my view, saying, look, if you become a member of the EEA, you have to accept free movement of labour. That's part of the deal. You can't cherry pick your conditions, which seems perfectly reasonable to me. And the problem is that for political reasons, because so many of the people who voted leave did so on anti-immigration grounds, she is, not all of them, but a significant portion of them, she's not prepared to do that. And so the result is that therefore it looks like we're going to actually not apply to join the EEA effectively. And that's going to cause enormous political ructions. Now, in the longer term, I think the British economy will do fine. There may be there'll be some losers, probably the City of London. There'll be some gainers though, manufacturers in particular, and exporters, consumers, because the price of a lot of goods like food will go down. It'll even out, it's a bit of a wash really, but in the short term there's going to be quite a lot of political fireworks.
So all that being said, aren't those subtle reasons that Brexit was actually the right decision? Because you guys still have to sort of negotiate things with the EU in a weird way that allow them to have power over you. And that was what the whole purpose of leaving was. So in a way, it's like better to do it now than 10 years when a lot of this stuff has even been tightened,
Absolutely,
right?
absolutely. I mean, the point is what Brexit does, and this was my main reason for voting for it. I wasn't a passionate leaver, but I did vote leave in the end. The main reason for doing it is that it increases the range of political possibilities open to the British electorate and the British government, for both good and bad. Right now, they're highly constrained because a whole lot of radical policies on both left and right would fall foul of the EU's own rules and regulations. So there's actually a very narrow range of what is allowable politically. Now that we have left the EU, or once we've left the EU, it becomes much wider. A whole range of options are opened up. Now, the job for me then is to argue for the right ones to be taken rather than really bad ones.
Right.
But
your job just started.
Exactly, yes. But that's my main reason for doing it. And I think there are much greater options open to us now in the future.
Yeah. Do you sense that the EU as a entity is really in trouble? I mean, everything beyond what just happened with you guys. I mean, they've got Greece basically in a hostage situation, right? I mean, am I being too?
No,
is that
not
too
at all.
hyperbolic?
I think most Greeks would agree with you.
But yeah, I mean, so what do you think the future here is? You have Britain leaving. You've got Greece in a hostage situation. I mean, ultimately, the borders that are crumbling, people aren't happy with.
Well, the real problem that the EU faces is the incredible act of hubris they did at the Maastricht Treaty, which is to create a single currency when they don't have a single government. Now, interestingly, pretty much every economist on the planet at the time, regardless of their politics, said that this was a really bad idea. And they all thought it was a bad idea for the same reason, which is that there's no historical case ever of a single currency area that doesn't have a single government surviving. And that if you do have a single currency area in countries that are not economically aligned, if you will, and you don't have a single government, all kinds of really bad stuff happens. Paul Krugman and Milton Friedman, in the same wake, made almost exactly the same point. Now, they ignored the advice from all the economists, and as Paul Krugman rather wittily put it, the good news is we know now that optimal currency area theory is completely correct. The bad news is we've had to bugger up the economy of a continent to do this.
To figure it out.
To prove it. So the point is they still haven't resolved that problem. Now, Greece is a small country. They can handle Greece. What if Italy goes under, which is quite likely? The Italian banking system is in really, really bad shape. If there's a major crisis in Italy, or maybe in France, or some other larger country, they won't be able to resolve it. So they're going to have to either create something like a government for the Eurozone, or they're going to have to allow the euro to be dismantled. And either of those is a huge event. Plus, there's an election next spring in France, and there's a pretty reasonable chance that Marine Le Pen will win the election. If she's up against one candidate from the centre-right, Alain Juppé, she will lose. If she's up against the former president, Nicolas Sarkozy, the polls show it's very, very close. And I would actually tip her to beat him.
Right, because that could be one of the situations where the polls are going to deflate her
Plus also,
support.
these polls now are before a campaign. She's a very effective campaigner. And so I think she could well beat the rival candidate if it's Sarkozy. Now, if she became president, I mean, the odds are still against that, but if she did, she said she'd immediately call a referendum on France leaving the EU. Now, all the polls there indicate 65% of the French public would vote leave. Now, if that happens, the EU is finished.
That's
it's done for, it's done for. So it's in a very tricky situation right now, the EU.
So for someone like yourself, again, classical liberal, and you want this to be about the individuals, so I can understand the separation, why you think ultimately this is good. It seems like in a weird way you then have to align yourself with the Marie Le Pens, with the, you end up by default falling into a category with the people that want to leave and with the nationalist streak that I don't sense that you have.
No.
So how do you negotiate that with yourself?
With great difficulty. This is the big problem. The problem for many classical liberals in the UK was, if we vote leave, will this not give a big boost to precisely the kind of politics that you most dislike? That was the argument to several of my colleagues, for example.
Yeah.
I think that basically you have to realize that if things like this happen, you are going to be alongside a bunch of people that otherwise you totally detest. And what you then have to do is to argue the case very, very strongly against them. Now, the crucial thing here, I think, is for liberals, both left and right, if you will, classical liberals and social liberals, to come together and to realize that they have common foes, if you will, in the shape of the national collectivists, and on the other hand, the radical left. And so here in the United States, for example, I think it's quite likely that there may well be a kind of rapprochement in the next few years between the kind of moderate part of the Republican Party, so-called, which is actually in many ways the more libertarian part, fiscally conservative but socially liberal, if you will, and on the other hand, the mainstream of the Democrats. And this will be aimed at both the kind of people who are now voting for Trump and also the kind of people who were supporting Bernie Sanders earlier on in the primary.
Yeah, so I know this political realignment is one of the things you've been talking about lately, and I love that because that's exactly what I've been trying to talk about, that I no longer, as a classical liberal, I don't really see conservatives as my enemy, as maybe 5 years ago I might have thought that they would be, where now it's like, yeah, we can have some disagreements about taxes and maybe we're not in the exact place related to abortion or a series of states' rights or whatever, but there has to be a new center developing here. Otherwise, a lot of classical liberals will end up going this, libertarians will end up going further to the right, classical liberals may go further to the left, and that's not good for anybody.
Well, indeed. I mean, the way to think of it is this, I think. Since about the 1970s, the big argument in politics on both sides of the Atlantic, but particularly here in the US, has been between one group of people who are economically interventionist and egalitarian but socially liberal, versus another group who are pro-free market but socially and culturally conservative. That's been the big division. What I think we're now moving towards is a situation where the divide is between one group of people who are broadly free market, broadly individualist, globalist, perhaps a bit more egalitarian than classical liberals would like, but broadly liberal, versus another group, which is the national collectivists I mentioned earlier, who are actually economically interventionist, pro-welfare state, but very culturally conservative, quite authoritarian, anti-globalist, anti-cosmopolitan. And that's the new division I think we're seeing in politics everywhere. And what that means is that a lot of the existing sort of groups are going to split up. So conservatives are going to have to decide, well, okay, what is more important to you? The cultural conservatism and the nationalism, or the free markets and the individualism? And if you're on the left, you have to decide, well, okay, what am I really more interested in? And if you're one of the kind of identitarian anti-globalist left, you actually may find yourself thinking, well, actually, I've probably got more in common in some ways with this kind of new emerging Hamiltonian nationalist politics. If on the other hand you really value individual liberty and globalism, openness to the rest of the world, then you're going to find yourself making alliances with these other people who are forming your opponents. So I think there's a kind of big shuffling of the deck going on in most Western democracies.
So as a historian, can you think of another time where we had such a, maybe not on a global scale because we're so connected now, but where you saw just these real fractures happening in real time? Like, when's the last time you saw something like this?
Well, the last time it happened in the UK, certainly, was in the 1960s and 1970s. And I think something like that happened over here in the United States as well, where you had this sudden reversal where the South went from being solidly democratic, where, if you found 2 Republican votes in a county, they'd reckon the guy must have voted twice, to the situation we have now, where the South is solidly Republican and the Democrats have become the party of the North entirely. That kind of switch took place then in the 60s and 70s. Similarly in the UK, back in the 1890s, here in the United States, with William Jennings Bryan, the Cross of Gold, and the famous, Democratic Convention in 1896, when the populists basically took over the Democratic Party. Major change in the nature of the Democratic Party, landslide victory of Republicans, again, big realignment of votes and interests in the states then. So this kind of thing has happened before. It's not unprecedented.
Yeah, but what do you add about the global element, where now it's like we're so connected, we're all on Twitter, we're all on watching TV and on the internet, and that these things are happening at once, and that where 100 years ago, if something happened across the pond, it mattered, but we didn't know about it for a while, versus now
Yeah.
it's all happening in real time.
This is true. I mean, there were more connections than you might imagine in the 19th century, but as you rightly say, they're much slower. So now there is much more of a global phenomenon. In fact, what is interesting is the very few countries where this kind of realignment isn't happening. Canada is one, not happened there so far. Spain is another, Japan. But generally speaking, you can see the same thing happening everywhere. And I think what happens is that because we're so interconnected, what happens in one part of the world tends to feed into what's happening elsewhere. Hence, the great interest that Donald Trump and his supporters have shown in Brexit and Nigel Farage coming over here and making all these talks. That would not have happened 100 years ago.
I don't think that would have happened. I don't think that would have happened 10 years ago. When I saw Nigel Farage out there at this rally, I thought this is really unprecedented. When is the last time that a leader from another country, even an ally, whatever, it doesn't matter, came and was supporting the opposition presidential candidate? I thought this is completely unprecedented.
It probably is true. It's a function of cheaper air travel and things like Twitter and the internet.